Hey everybody, CVH here with a deck tech on the Midrange Mimic Scout. This is a deck that's not really a revolutionary or new concept currently. It's sort of been in existence since the Madhouse collection was released for Illusory Mimic itself. And even before then, Midrange Scout was played on the ladder for a few different variations, dating back to basically the time I started the game. But this is a deck that I haven't really talked about on the channel before, and it's been gaining some popularity on the ladder. I've been playing a little bit, testing some different versions of cards and stuff, so I figured I'd take this time to sort of go over it. If you're new to the game or haven't really seen the style of deck before, give you an idea of how it wins, how it operates, and specific card choices that you can include, flex spots in the deck. So yeah, while this version isn't necessarily the most standard, I am testing some specific card choices myself. I'll be sort of talking about the basics more so. So we can't really start talking about the deck without talking first about Illusory Mimic, the card that sort of makes the specific style of Midrange Scout viable, coming from the Madhouse collection. So if you are planning on playing this deck on the ladder, you will need to get the Madhouse collection. That's just how it works. 6-drop 5/5, summon Illusory Mimic gains all keywords that the top 3 cards of your deck have, which are Breakthrough, Charge, Drain, Guard, Lethal, Regenerate, and Ward. So it just reveals the top 3 cards by itself. It doesn't show you or your opponent the top 3 cards. You don't get like double charge or double drain or something, or double ward if you reveal 2 with the same keyword, but you will get all the keywords that all the top 3 cards of your deck have. For example, if Giant Bat, Windkeep Spellsword, and Windkeep Spellsword are your top 3, you're going to be getting charge, drain, and ward. And if the only thing in your top 3 that has a keyword is a Cliff Racer, you'll just have a 6-drop 5/5 charge, which by itself is great. So a lot of the card choices in this deck wouldn't make sense without the Mimic. Other mid-range Scout decks probably wouldn't play cards like Territorial Viper or Giant Bat. Maybe they would, they probably would not though. So you gotta take, a lot of the card considerations are based on the fact that we want Mimic to usually have charge, and a lot of the other ones can be helpful as well. For example, Drain against another aggressive deck. A charge Drain 6-drop 5/5 could just seal the game. If it has Guard, your opponent's also gonna have to attack it. Ward against a control deck is going to make this very hard to kill in a deck where a lot of things are already pretty hard to deal with. That's basically the centerpiece of the strategy, just an additional very powerful threat that can function as some burst damage as well. So we start at the bottom of the curve like usual. And I already have to talk about a couple flex spots. First, I'll just talk about what I'm playing in these spots currently in this build that you can see on the screen. We have 3 Iliac Sorcerer, basically decent 1-drop, along with Ward. Not really much to say about this card. If you get it off of the Illusory Mimic, it's going to have Ward, which is already pretty good. 3 Daring Cutburst, 3 Dragon Tail Savior, 3 Windkeep Spellsword as basically the 2-drops on curve that we start playing and punching with, and 3 Thieves Guild Recruits because they're a solid card. Excuse me, they're going to cycle, get you closer to other threats in your deck, and potentially even reduce the magic cost of Bone Colossus Nogli or Tazcad the Packmaster. So there are some flex spots already to talk about. A lot of the versions, while Iliac Sorcerer is great to reveal off the Mimic because it gets Ward, a lot of the versions don't play this card, and a lot of the versions don't play Dragon Tail Savior. What winds up happening instead in a lot of these cases, I meant to mention the fact that I also currently do not play Red Brahmin. A lot of the lists do have this card. I've seen some without Nogleaf. That's just a personal thing. I thought Nogleaf would be more effective, but that's one thing we can't reduce off the Thieves Guild Recruit. Neither here nor there. A lot of people play over the Iliac Sorcerer 3 copies of Shadow Shift, moving a friendly creature and drawing a card, and the reason they do so is because over the Dragon Tail Saviors, a lot of these lists are going to be playing Mournhold Trader. Just packs more of a punch, but it is a little bit more it's not more fragile, obviously, because Dragon Tail Savior is harder to kill, but we want Mournhold Trader to live even more because we don't want our opponents to get the guard, obviously. So it sort of makes the most sense if you're playing at least the Shadow Shift to sort of move it out of harm's way. We don't have Wordcrafter. I don't have access to cards like Wordcrafter in this class, so opposing Fighters Guild Recruits can be a problem if you're not playing Murkwater Witch, which is also a card that some of these versions do play, so some flex spots there. Thieves Guild Recruit, like I mentioned, is fantastic to get you deeper in your deck to continue the string of threats. If you're up against a more aggressive meta, you might want to switch it out for its brother, basically, Fighters Guild Recruit, better against aggression, and Thieves Guild Recruit's going to continue the threats and give you earlier threats against control decks. You could even play both, but playing that many 2-drops that don't necessarily attack on curve could be bad, but you could cut Iliac Sorcerer. But yeah, some of those are flex spots. Iliac Sorcerer, Shadow Shift, and Shadow Shift and Mournhold Trader are sort of a package in themselves, and we're sort of playing more standalone good cards, sort of anticipating a control meta currently with the Thieves Guild Recruits and just playing the Saviors and the Iliac Sorcerer, Iliac good with the Mimic, Dragon Tail Savior, basically, no real downside to this card. So moving on to the 3-drops, we have basically what you would expect in a mid-range deck, which is, an aggro deck, basically, that's a little bit slower with higher density of threats. We have the Young Mammoths and the Haunting Spirits as with 3-ofs, because these are basically some of the best 3-drops for aggressive strategies in the entire game. And since we get to play Endurance, so we get access to each of them, and we probably should just play 3 of each of those. and Giant Bat, which is a little questionable if you're just coming into this game after a break or something and you weren't privy to Illusory Mimic existing. You'd probably question why this is seeing play, basically because Charge and Drain on Mimic is fantastic. As a standalone card, obviously pretty much worse than Haunting Spirit and Young Mammoth, but can be useful in some of those aggressive decks as well. 2 burst damage is not a lot of burst damage, but it is more than 0, so just having additional charges in your deck can allow you to get there in the very, very late stages of the game, and Charge is obviously a pretty powerful keyword when you're up against other aggressive decks, period. Arcane Elite, this is a lethal by itself, and Lucian Lechance is also a lethal, so these both work with the Mimic as well. The Arcane Elite, specifically, I've seen some versions with Lucian, but Arcane Elite basically doesn't see much play. Someone sent me a list that they were using, so I'm testing this over what was being played. Which is normally, instead of Lucian or the Arcane Elite, we see 3 copies of Preserver of the Root, which doesn't itself have a keyword, but in the late game can be a 4-drop 6/6 with Guard, which is fantastic, obviously, and earlier in the game they sort of have to feel pressured to get rid of it while it's a 4/4, otherwise it'll get large like that. I've had success with the Arcane Elite. This is sort of a flex spot as well. But basically, we're just going to at least play one 4-drop that's sort of good on curve. The Arcane Elite sort of makes a lot of sense to me because it deals very effectively early with Hive Defenders, so you don't necessarily have to use your Territorial Vipers. Deals very effectively with Thorn Mage against those slower Ramp Scout decks. But yeah, both of these they've been pretty good to me, but I haven't tested enough over the Preserve of the Root to know which is actually better. But basically, the decks are probably playing one of these copies, like one of these, either 2 in 1 or the 3 copies of Preserver of the Root. Some will play Lucian along with the Preserver as well. 3 copies of Moonlight Werebat, fantastic prophecy still to get against a lot of these super aggro decks. On curve, not so great at the moment because of the high density of Dragon, of Windkeep Spellsword, Daggerfall Mage, and Firebolt, but obviously it does have Drain too, so that's one more way we can maximize our Mimic value. Territorial Viper, another card that you might not be familiar with too much in constructed play. Usually Leaf Lurkers run over this card in a lot of these types of decks, but the fact that this gives you charge on the Illusory Mimic as well as functioning as a 4-cost Piercing Javelin a lot of the time against a powerful guard is very valuable for this deck. Definitely a staple if you're trying to play the Mimic value game. It doesn't even really need the lethal on the Mimic. If you have the charge from the Viper, that's good enough, but obviously Viper, as a standalone removal spell basically, is a fantastic card for this deck when you're just trying to push through those guards. It already took down an Iron Atronach for me in the first day I was testing this version of the deck. And I guess, situations like that, just any large guard, they're not always going to be able to play around the Territorial Viper because it's just so efficient as removal, so definitely a fantastic card for this deck. So now we move on to the 5-drops with some more standard cards. We have 3 copies each of some pretty premium 5-drops, Cliff Racer, Shadowfen Priest, and Thorn Mage. I did a whole video on Shadowfen Priest, don't really need to talk about it too much. Fantastic utility card, and the stats are reasonable enough to where we'd put it in an aggressive deck like this. Cliff Racer, I call it the Green Lightning Bolt, just insane value. 5-drop 4/4 can trade pretty efficiently with other aggressive decks, and of course it just pushes a ridiculous amount of damage while being probably the best charge we could play for Illusory Mimic value. Thorn Mage, we usually see this in Ramp Scout decks. We're not really focused on the ramp, but this card has a pretty threateningly sized body in the first place. And the important thing to note about this card is it goes very well right into our Bone Colossus turn, or Bone Colossus or Nogli or something like that, or Ring a Hist Mage into your Illusory Mimic or something like that. The ramp does actually matter if you play this card on curve in this deck. So while we're not a ramp strategy, we're not going to try to get to 15 max Magicka or anything. We should have closed the game long before then. The card itself does pose a serious threat while protecting your other cards if need be. If they can't get past the 5 guard, they won't be able to attack the things that are easier to kill, like the Dragon Tail Saviors and Giant Bats, which is important. It gives guard to the Mimic, which is sort of just a bonus. It gets bigger over time, which is sort of just a bonus, and it sort of gets you into your threatening cards a turn earlier than your opponent would be prepared to deal with them, perhaps. Illusory Mimic, already talked about it, centerpiece of the deck, really good card for when you're pushing for lethal. Definitely a bit unreliable, so counting on this card is not recommended, but when you're already even on board or ahead on board, just looking to sort of compound that, you could sack out a charge drain or a charge ward or a ward guard, like any of those, just going to put your opponent super far behind. Bone Colossus, as mentioned, this card is seeing sort of resurgence in play. Super powerful against any of those late game control decks. Very, very difficult card to answer with a single card, which itself makes it an incredibly valuable finisher for a mid-range deck like this. The fact that we can sometimes ramp into it or decrease its cost with Thieves Guild is just icing on the cake. Turn 4 Bone Colossus is just backbreaking against so many of these decks. So probably the finisher of choice, I would say, in this deck. If you don't have Bone Colossus, I'd consider getting them if you're going to play some mid-range decks using Endurance. I don't see it sort of being bad anytime soon. Very powerful against decks like Control Spellsword, Ramp Scout, and Merrick Battle Mage, to name a few. When you're playing from behind, obviously this card isn't the best, but you shouldn't be playing from behind too much. This deck is pretty weak to super fast aggro decks unless you get lucky with some prophecies early anyway. So Nogleave, I'm playing this card. Some people don't play this card. I think it's just a very valuable card through and through. One of the best cards in Endurance, in my opinion. For these mid-range decks, it doesn't get Piercing Javelin again. It's hard to answer with one card. It can be answered by some single cards like Manacora, but those happen later in the game. So if this card comes out on curve or even earlier, it's a huge threat that will simultaneously prevent your aggro opponent or mid-range mirror match opponent from killing you, while threatening probably almost guaranteed lethal, since this card is so hard to interact with. So I really like this card in the strategy. I would recommend it, I think. And Tazcad the Packmaster needs no introduction, really. We can reduce it, we can sort of ramp to it. It's our only 9 cost, so we don't feel too bogged down in this deck by the curve or anything. And of course, it gets charge and breakthrough to the Illusory Mimic, so just one more charge we can pack into the deck. And, this deck, while it is a very powerful deck, is not the fastest curve ever. We'll sometimes have to play sort of the slower game and just the value trades earlier in the game, leading to the crazy burst damage from the Cliff Racer, the Mimics, and the other finishers later in the game. So games often go to 9, and you will be able to play Tazcad a lot of the time, even though it was nerfed a while back from 8 to 9. Definitely still a worthwhile inclusion in this deck. So that's basically the list. Like I mentioned, some flex spots include the Fighters Guild Recruit being Thieves Guild Recruit. If you want to play Mournhold Guardian, Mournhold Trader, excuse me. Don't play Mournhold Guardian, the one drop. Play Mournhold Trader, if anything, over the Dragontail Savior. But I do recommend switching out the Iliac Sorcerers or something else for Shadow Shift to sort of give you more game against cards like Fighters Guild Recruit. That's one thing. Preserver of the Root, like I said, is fine. Like, the lethals are also fine if you want additional ways to just really hard to deal with cards that your opponent's probably not going to be able to defend too well against. Lucian Lechance also does get some value in this deck because your cards are pretty high stats, basically. Besides that, some flex spots. Basically, Red Brahmin is the last flex spot I can really think of off the top of my head. If you want to just cut one of the other late game cards or mid game cards for Red Brahmin, it works as well. If you want to firmly tech against aggro decks besides the Fighters Guild and the Thieves Guild Recruit change, you could even play a card like Midnight Sweep, perhaps. A lot of different options out there. Basically, this deck's just going to be trying to get on the board as soon as possible, getting aggressive as soon as possible against slower decks, and trying to stave off. In mid-range decks, you'll take some value trades because your cards have such good stats. If you can, cards like Daggerfall Mage are pretty hard to trade with, but a lot of the cards you'll be playing, you'll have just better stats than your opponent. Against aggro decks, you'll be playing from behind, and you might have to get a little lucky, but against mid-range decks, you'll take some trades, then start to get aggressive. Against control, you should probably just overwhelm them with your threats on every sort of stage of the curve, leading up to cards like Bone Colossus, which are almost impossible to deal with. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of how the deck works and some key cards in the strategy. Hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Leave a comment and a like if you have. Again, feel free to subscribe to the channel for more strategy videos, deck techs, stream highlights, other things, and follow the stream at the link I'll post in the description below. With all that said, I guess I'll just see you next time, guys.